For our first story, we take you to New Orleans, Louisiana. February 9th, 2016. Mardi Gras was in full swing. Laughter, music, and celebration filled the streets. But beneath the revelry, something far more sinister was unfolding. Emma and her best friend Rachel had spent the night hopping from one bar to another, soaking in the energy of the city. By the time they reached the Hollow Tavern, it was nearly 2 a.m. The bar was old, one of those dimly lit places with peeling wallpaper, antique mirrors, and the kind of energy that felt heavier than it should. It wasn't their first choice, but it was open late, and the promise of one last drink before heading back to their Airbnb seemed like a good idea. Emma immediately felt it the moment they stepped inside. The air was thick, almost oppressive. The place wasn't packed, but a few scattered patrons sat hunched over their drinks, eyes dull and distant. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong, but she shook it off, blaming the alcohol already swimming in her system. They made their way to the bar, ordering 2 whiskey sours. The bartender, a gaunt man in his 40s, barely looked up as he slid their drinks across the counter. His face was pale, drawn, like he hadn't slept in days. Then Rachel nudged her. "Don't look now," she whispered, leaning in close. "But there's a guy in the back staring at us." Emma's pulse quickened. Against her better judgment, she turned slightly, just enough to glance toward the back of the bar. There was a man sitting alone in one of the dark corner booths. His face was shrouded in shadow, his posture unnervingly still. Something about the way he sat, perfectly rigid, made her stomach tighten. "Creepy," she muttered, turning back. Rachel smirked. "Think he's gonna buy us a drink?" Emma rolled her eyes, but the unease in her chest wouldn't go away. There was something off about the man, the way he didn't move, the way the other patrons seemed to avoid looking in his direction. Then, out of nowhere, the bartender spoke. "You should leave." Emma's head snapped up. "What?" The bartender wiped a glass, not meeting her gaze. "I said you should leave now." Rachel scoffed. "Why? Because of him?" She gestured toward the booth. The bartender's grip on the glass tightened. His knuckles turned white. "There is no one sitting in that booth." Emma felt her stomach drop. Her breath hitched as she turned back toward the booth, this time slower. The air around her suddenly felt ice cold. The booth was empty, but that didn't make sense. She had seen him. They both had. Rachel let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, are we drunk? Or is this some kind of joke?" The bartender wasn't laughing. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he set the glass down. "If you're seeing him," he said quietly, "it means he's noticed you." Emma's blood ran cold. "What the hell does that mean?" she whispered. The bartender sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "People see him sometimes. The man in the booth. They say he's been here longer than the bar itself. You make eye contact with him and—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Emma swallowed hard. "And what?" The bartender looked at her then, his eyes hollow and dark. "And you don't go home alone." A chill crept down her spine. Rachel, still trying to shake off the tension, grabbed her drink. "Okay, this is officially too weird. Let's just finish our drinks and—" The lights flickered. Every hair on Emma's body stood on end. The bar went completely silent. And then, a whisper, right next to her ear. "Don't leave yet." Emma screamed, jumping off her stool so fast she nearly knocked the drink over. Rachel turned, eyes wide. "What? What happened?" Emma clutched her chest, her breathing ragged. Someone just whispered in my ear. Rachel's face drained of color. "Emma," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma turned to her friend, confused, until she saw where Rachel was looking. the booth. He was there again. Except this time Emma could see his face. His eyes were completely black. Not just the irises, but the entire sclera. His mouth curled into a grin, his lips splitting too wide, revealing teeth that were wrong, jagged, almost broken. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished. The chair he had been sitting in slid back on its own, the sound of wood scraping against the floor making Emma's stomach lurch. Rachel grabbed her hand. "We're leaving. Now." They didn't wait to finish their drinks. They bolted for the door, the bartender's voice following after them. "Don't go straight home. Don't—" The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them before they could hear the rest. They sprinted back toward the Airbnb, the streets feeling eerily empty despite the Mardi Gras crowds just a few blocks away. Neither of them spoke, their breath visible in the unseasonably cold air. It wasn't until they were inside, the door locked and bolted, that Rachel finally broke the silence. "You heard him, didn't you?" Emma nodded. "You saw him too." Rachel exhaled sharply. "We should have listened to the bartender." Emma's heart pounded against her ribs. She didn't want to ask, but she had to. Why? Rachel swallowed hard, then turned her phone toward Emma. She had taken a picture inside the bar just before they left. A blurry, rushed shot of the dimly lit room. Emma's eyes locked onto the dark corner booth. There were no people in the image. But there was something else. A reflection. In the mirror behind the booth. Not of a man, but of something tall, thin, with elongated fingers pressing against the glass. Its mouth stretched too wide. Its hollow black eyes stared directly at them. And beneath the reflection, carved into the wooden table, was one word: stay. For our second story, we go to Boston, Massachusetts. October 28th, 2007. The Iron Lantern was a bar that had stood the test of time, dark wood, low ceilings, and an eerie quiet that settled in late at night. But on this particular night, that silence would be shattered. It was a local staple, nestled between brick alleyways in the heart of Boston, known more for its history than its drinks. Matt had been bartending there for 3 years, and by now, he knew the usuals. The regular drunks, the lonely old men who never spoke but always tipped, the rowdy college kids who stumbled in before closing. But there was one patron he could never quite figure out: the man in the brown coat. He always sat in the same seat, near the far end of the bar where the overhead light flickered unpredictably. He never spoke, never ordered. He just sat there, still as a statue, watching. The first time Matt noticed him, he assumed he had come in with a group and just hadn't left. But as the nights passed, he realized something unsettling. No one else seemed to notice him. Matt would watch as customers took the stool right next to the man, completely unaware of his presence. They would chat, laugh, even lean into what should have been his space, as if he wasn't even there. But Matt saw him. One night, curiosity got the best of him. The bar was nearly empty. Just a few regulars nursing their last drinks before close. The man in the brown coat sat in his usual spot, hands resting on the counter. Matt decided to test something. He walked over and placed a coaster in front of the man. Then, without a word, he set down an unopened beer. The moment the glass touched the counter, the lights flickered violently. The air turned ice cold, his breath visible in the dim glow. The regulars didn't react. No one seemed to notice, but Matt felt it. Something was very, very wrong. Then the beer bottle shifted. It didn't slide. It didn't tip over. It turned, slowly, deliberately. And then the man in the brown coat finally moved. His head lifted just slightly, his face still obscured by the shadow of his hood. Matt's stomach tightened. Then came the whisper, low, raspy, right in his ear. "You shouldn't have done that." Matt recoiled, heart slamming against his ribs. He spun around, but no one was behind the bar. He looked back at the stool. The man was gone. But the beer bottle? It had shattered. Completely. Not broken in half, not cracked, but reduced to shards, as if something had crushed it in an instant. That was the first night Matt dreamt of him. It wasn't a normal dream. In it, he was standing behind the bar, alone. The room was wrong. The lights too dim, the shadows stretching too far. The air smelled of rot, of damp wood and something else, something metallic. Then he saw him, the man in the brown coat. Except now, his hood had slipped back. His skin was wrong, gray, mottled, like something left in the water too long. His eyes were sunken, hollow, and his mouth. Matt never remembered what his mouth looked like. He always woke up before he could see. The dreams continued for weeks. Every night, the same setting, the same figure, the same feeling of absolute paralyzing dread. One night, desperate to break the cycle, he brought it up to his boss, an old bartender who had been working there for over 40 years. The man's face paled. "You saw him?" Matt nodded, hesitating. "Who is he?" His boss swallowed hard, setting down his towel. "A long time ago, back in the 70s, there was a man who used to drink here every night. Always wore a brown coat. Never talked to anyone. Just sat at the bar. One night, he left late, just before closing. They found him the next morning in the alley out back, stabbed. The coroner said he must have tried to crawl back inside, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Matt's throat went dry. "And now?" His boss sighed. "And now, sometimes, he comes back." Matt left the job a few months later. The dreams had stopped, but he could never shake the feeling that something had lingered, like a presence still following him, waiting. Years passed, and he tried to forget. Until one night, while having drinks with an old friend who had taken over bartending at the Iron Lantern, the topic resurfaced. His friend was laughing, clearly drunk, when he said, "Do you remember the man in the brown coat?" Matt's body went rigid. His friend smirked. "Yeah, I swear I see him sometimes. Always at the end of the bar. Thought it was just my imagination, but last week..." He took a sip of his beer, shaking his head. "I set a drink down in front of his seat, just for fun." Matt's breath caught. His friend's expression darkened. The bottle shattered. For our last story, we take you to London, England, March 14th, 2013. The Black Hart, one of the oldest pubs in the city, stood hidden in a quiet alley near Camden. It had centuries of history, but on this night, it would become part of something far more sinister. The kind of place where the walls held on to the whispers of long-dead patrons, where the air always seemed thick, like it had absorbed too much of the past. Lucy had been working there for almost a year. She loved the job, mostly. The dim lighting, the smell of aged wood and stale beer, it had a certain charm. But there was something about the pub at night that unsettled her. When the last patrons stumbled out and the doors were locked, the place felt different, colder, still, like someone was watching. That night, the bar had been busier than usual. A group of university students had stuck around, laughing loudly over their pints. Lucy was clearing glasses when she noticed someone at the far end of the bar. A man sitting alone, nursing a glass of whiskey. He was older, maybe in his 50s, dressed in a dark suit. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, something about them made her uneasy. They were dark, too dark, like two pits that swallowed the light. He hadn't ordered from her, and she didn't remember seeing him come in. But there he was, watching, She forced a smile. "Another drink?" The man didn't answer. He just tilted his head slightly as if considering something. Then, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, he said, "He's still here, you know." Lucy frowned. "Sorry?" The man smiled. It was small, barely there, but something about it sent a chill through her. "The man in the cellar," he said. "He doesn't like when people stay too late." Her stomach twisted. The Black Heart had stories. Every old pub did. The most well-known was the legend of Henry Vale, a bartender from the early 1900s who had gone missing one night after closing. Some said he was murdered in the cellar, his body hidden away. Others believed he had simply walked out and never returned. But one thing was certain. People who worked here always spoke of something lingering in the basement. Strange noises. Shadows moving when no one was there. Lucy forced out a nervous laugh. "I think you've had one too many." The man's smile faded. "You don't believe me," he murmured. Then he pushed his untouched glass forward and stood. "But you will." Lucy blinked. The air around her suddenly felt heavier, thicker. She turned to grab a cloth, but when she looked back, he was gone. The stool empty, the glass completely dry, as if he had never been there at all. She didn't have time to dwell on it. The students were finally leaving and her shift was almost over. She locked the doors, swept the floors, and went to restock the beer kegs in the cellar. The stairs leading down creaked under her weight, the air growing colder with every step. The cellar was worse than usual that night. The dim, flickering light barely illuminated the rows of shelves, the barrels lined against the stone walls. Lucy hurried, wanting to get back upstairs as quickly as possible. Then she heard it. A soft, scraping sound. She froze, her breath catching. It was coming from the far end of the cellar near the old wooden door that had been locked since she started working there. The door that, according to the owner, led to nothing but a bricked-up passageway. The scraping grew louder. Lucy took a step back. The air had turned ice-cold, her breath visible in the dim light. Something was behind that door. Then, a single knock. Slow. Deliberate. Lucy backed up the stairs, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the light switch. But before she could reach it, the door slammed open. She screamed, nearly falling as she scrambled up the stairs. The air behind her felt like it was moving, pressing against her like unseen hands reaching out. She made it to the top, slamming the cellar door shut and locking it. Silence. Her heart pounded in her chest. She stood there for what felt like hours, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No sounds. Just the heavy silence pressing in around her. She forced herself to breathe. It was just her imagination. It had to be. Then, a whisper, right behind her ear. "Don't lock the door." The breath on her neck was warm, real. Lucy turned, expecting to see someone standing there, but the pub was empty, except the old mirror above the bar. Her own reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed, face pale with fear. But something was wrong. She wasn't alone. A man stood behind her in the reflection. His face was gaunt, hollow, his eyes sunken. His clothes were old-fashioned, stained with something dark. Henry Vale. Her stomach turned. Then, slowly, in the mirror, he smiled. Lucy ran. She didn't lock up. She didn't turn off the lights. She just ran, bolting through the front doors, gasping for air the moment she hit the cold night. She never went back. A week later, the owner called her. He was irritated, saying she had left the bar unlocked, left everything a mess. He paused before mentioning something else. When he went to check the cellar door, he found it hanging open. The old wooden door, the one that had been locked for decades, was gone. The passageway it led to, wide open. And at the bottom of the stairs, in the dust that hadn't been disturbed in years, a single set of footprints, leading out. Bars are supposed to be places of laughter, music, and late-night memories. But sometimes they hold on to something darker. Things that never left. Shadows that still linger. Watching. Waiting. A man who disappears the moment you blink. A presence in the basement that doesn't want to stay locked away. A silent drinker who reminds you that some patrons never really leave. These stories weren't just urban legends. They happened. To real people. And if they could happen to them, maybe next time you're at a bar, you should check twice before sitting alone. If you enjoyed these terrifying true stories, like, share, and subscribe to The Sixth Frequency. And don't forget to hit the bell icon, because in the world of horror, the real nightmares are the ones you don't see coming. See you in the next one, if you make it.